Margaret Chen stood at her kitchen window, watching 58 identical suburban homes disappear into the earth like dominoes falling in reverse. The screaming had stopped, the dust was settling, and somewhere beneath tons of Georgia clay and shattered dreams lay the bodies of the people who'd stolen her family's century-old farm through legal loopholes and neighborhood politics. She should call 911. She should feel horror. Instead, she felt the first peace she'd known in 3 years, because the sinkhole had opened exactly where her great-grandfather's surveyor maps said the old limestone caverns ran deepest. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in Millbrook Springs, Georgia. Margaret Chen pressed her face against the cool glass of her kitchen window. Watching the sunrise paint the sprawling subdivision that had consumed her family's land, 58 homes in perfect rows, each one identical except for the mailbox colors their HOA had pre-approved. Each one worth more than her great-grandfather had made in his entire life farming this red clay earth. Still staring at them won't make them disappear. Maggie. She turned to find her daughter Sarah pouring coffee into a thermos, her nurse. Scrubs already wrinkled from a double shift at the county hospital. At 26, Sarah had inherited her mother's sharp cheekbones and her late father's stubborn chin. But the exhaustion in her eyes belonged to their current circumstances, working 3 jobs between them to keep their small farmhouse, while lawyers bled them dry with appeals they couldn't afford. "I wasn't staring," Margaret lied, accepting the cup Sarah offered. "I was remembering." "Remembering won't pay the legal bills either." Margaret bit back her response. Sarah didn't understand what it meant to lose land that had been in the family since 1887. To watch bulldozers tear up the peach orchard where her grandmother had taught her to can preserves. To see her great-grandfather's hand-built stone walls reduced to decorative landscaping around a community pool. The subdivision Springs Estates had risen in 18 months, a testament to modern efficiency and Margaret's legal naivety. The developers had found a century-old surveying error that shifted the property lines by 43 acres. 43 acres that contained everything except this house and the 2 acres immediately surrounding it. The county had sided with the developers. The state appeals court had sided with the developers. Even the media had painted Margaret as a stubborn old woman standing in the way of progress and affordable housing. Affordable Margaret? Almost laughed. The cheapest house in Millbrook Springs started at $400,000. "Mom, you need to let this go." Sarah's voice carried the gentle exhaustion of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. "The Hendersons made you a fair offer for the house. We could start over somewhere else, maybe move to Savannah, where I could work at the trauma center full-time." Margaret set down her coffee cup harder than necessary. "Your great-great-grandfather built this house with lumber he cut from trees that grew in that soil." She gestured toward the window. "Your father proposed to me beside the creek that used to run where their tennis courts are now. And you want me to let it go? I want you to be happy again." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. When had she stopped being happy? When Jim died 5 years ago? When the developers first knocked on her door 3 years ago with their fake smiles and legal papers? Or when she realized that all her fighting had only succeeded in making her daughter old before her time? Before she could answer, a sound like distant thunder rolled across the subdivision. Both women froze. Margaret knew every sound this land could make: the whistle of wind through the old oak grove, the rumble of trucks on Highway 47, the crack of settling wood in winter. This was something else entirely. What was that? Sarah moved to the window beside her mother. The sound came again, deeper this time, accompanied by a vibration they could feel through the floorboards. Margaret's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "Earthquake," Sarah suggested, but her voice carried doubt. Georgia rarely experienced seismic activity. Margaret pressed her palm against the window glass. The vibration was stronger here, as if the earth itself was humming. In the subdivision, she could see people emerging from their houses, mothers in bathrobes, fathers still holding coffee, mugs, children in school clothes, pointing at nothing in particular. Then she saw the cracks. They started as hairline fractures in the asphalt of Harmony Lane, the subdivision's main thoroughfare. Thin black lines that looked almost decorative against the pristine suburban landscape. But they spread as Margaret watched, branching like lightning frozen in stone, reaching toward the identical houses with their identical lawns and identical mailboxes. "Sarah," Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. "Get your emergency kit from the closet." "Mom, what?" The third rumble cut off Sarah's question. This time, the sound didn't fade. It grew deeper, more resonant, like the earth itself had found its voice and decided to sing a funeral dirge. Margaret's grandmother's china rattled in the hutch. The old house creaked and swayed, but it held built on bedrock, just like great-grandfather Chen had insisted. Unlike the subdivision, Margaret watched in fascination as the cracks in the asphalt widened from hairlines to fissures to genuine breaks in the earth. The residents of Millbrook Springs Estates had stopped pointing and started running. Some toward their cars, some toward the main road, some simply running with the desperate purpose of prey animals who sensed a predator but couldn't identify the threat. "Mom," Sarah grabbed her arm, "we need to get out of here." But Margaret couldn't move. She stood transfixed as the ground beneath 1247 Harmony Lane, the Hendersons' house. The people who'd offered to buy her out began to sag like a cake falling in the oven. The foundation cracked with a sound like breaking bones, the perfectly manicured lawn rippled like water, and then the entire house, 4 bedrooms. 3 baths, granite countertops, stainless steel, appliances, stilted sideways and slid into the earth with almost gentle resignation. Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning rose bushes disappeared first, followed by the 2-car garage, then the house itself, like some massive hand was pulling it down from below. The sound was indescribable, wood splintering, glass shattering, and underneath it all, the deep groan of earth moving in ways it was never meant to move. "Dear God," Sarah breathed. 1249 Harmony Lane tilted and fell. 1251 followed, then 1253, each house disappearing into the growing maw that had opened in the earth. The cracks spread to Serenity Circle, then to Peaceful Way, consuming the subdivision with methodical precision. Margaret found her voice. "The limestone, what?" "The limestone caverns." Great-grandfather's maps showed limestone caverns running under the eastern section. Margaret's words came faster now, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The developers never did a geological survey. They said the county's environmental study from 1987 was sufficient. Sarah stared at her mother. "You knew this could happen." "I suspected the ground might be unstable, but this..." Margaret gestured at the devastation outside their window. "This is beyond anything I imagined." House after house disappeared into the earth. The community pool, the tennis courts, the playground where children had laughed just hours ago, swallowed by the hungry ground. The sound was constant now, a roar like a waterfall made of stone and wood and broken dreams. Margaret counted, 15 houses gone, 20. 30. The mathematics of destruction played out with terrible precision. All the people who'd moved here seeking their piece of the American dream on land that had been stolen from her family through legal technicalities and bureaucratic sleight of hand. "We should call 911, Sarah said, but she made no move toward the phone. "Yes," Margaret agreed, but she too remained frozen at the window. 40 houses, 50. The emergency sirens had started now, distant wails growing closer. But what could they do? You couldn't fight a sinkhole with fire trucks and good intentions. Margaret thought of the developers' Pinnacle Properties and their smooth-talking lawyers. She thought of their promises about soil stability and their dismissal of her concerns about the old surveyor maps. She thought of the county commissioners, who'd rubber-stamped the project without requiring updated geological studies. She thought of the neighbors who'd testified that her challenges to the development were frivolous and self-serving. 55 houses, 56, 57. The last house to fall was 1298 Serenity Circle, where the Homeowners Association president lived. Robert Kraft, the man who'd called her a bitter old woman clinging to the past at the final county commission hearing. His house held on longer than the others, perched on the edge of the sinkhole like it was making a last stand. Then the earth beneath it gave way with finality, and Robert Kraft's dreams of suburban perfection disappeared into the same limestone caverns that her great-grandfather had marked on his hand-drawn maps in 1887. 58 houses, all gone. Margaret and Sarah stood in perfect silence, watching the dust settle over what had been a thriving subdivision 30 minutes ago. The morning sun slanted through the haze, illuminating the massive crater that had swallowed an entire community. Emergency vehicles were arriving, now fire truck. The first reporter arrived before the last ambulance left. Margaret watched from her porch as a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a microphone emerged from a news van, her heels clicking against the asphalt that had somehow remained intact on this side of the massive crater. Behind her, a cameraman struggled with equipment while trying to avoid the growing crowd of emergency responders, displaced residents, and curious onlookers who'd driven from neighboring towns to witness the disaster. "Ma'am, I'm Jessica Torres from Channel 7 News." The reporter's smile was as polished as her appearance, but her eyes held the hungry gleam of someone who sensed a career-making story. "We understand you're the property owner adjacent to the sinkhole. Could we get a statement about what you witnessed this morning?" Margaret glanced at Sarah, who stood beside her with arms crossed, still wearing her wrinkled scrubs. They'd spent the last 4 hours answering questions from fire marshals, county officials, and state emergency management personnel. Each conversation had been a careful dance around the truth that sat like a stone in Margaret's chest. "I saw the ground open up and swallow 58 homes," Margaret said simply. "And you weren't surprised by this?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret could feel Sarah's tension, could sense the weight of everything unsaid pressing against the morning silence. In the distance, heavy machinery rumbled as crews worked to secure the perimeter of the sinkhole and search for survivors. So far, they'd found none. "I was surprised by the scope," Margaret answered carefully, "but not by the possibility." "Jessica." Torres leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. "What do you mean by that?" Before Margaret could answer, a black SUV pulled up to the edge of her driveway. 2 men in expensive suits emerged, their faces grim. Margaret recognized them immediately. David Pinnacle, the lead developer of Millbrook Springs Estates, and his attorney, James Morrison. The same men who'd sat across from her in countless meetings, their condescending smiles never wavering as they explained why her objections to their project were legally and scientifically baseless. They weren't smiling now, Mrs. Chen. David Pinnacle's voice carried the strain of a man whose life's work had just collapsed into the earth. "We need to talk." "I'm sure you do," Margaret replied, not moving from her porch. James Morrison stepped forward, his lawyer's instincts kicking in despite the circumstances. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, away from the media." Jessica Torres raised her microphone. "Mr. Pinnacle, as the developer of Millbrook Springs Estates, what's your response to the complete destruction of the subdivision?" No comment. At this time, Morrison intercepted, "We're cooperating fully with the investigation, and our thoughts are with the affected families. But you must have some explanation for how an entire subdivision could simply sink into the ground." Margaret watched the exchange with detached fascination. 3 years of legal battles had taught her to read the micro-expressions of desperate men. Pinnacle's jaw twitched when he tried to maintain eye contact with the reporter. Morrison's hand moved toward his phone every few seconds, the unconscious gesture of someone expecting very bad news. "The geological causes of this tragic event are still being investigated," Morrison said. "It would be inappropriate to speculate." "Mrs. Chen," Jessica Torres turned back to Margaret. "You mentioned you weren't surprised by the possibility of ground collapse. Did you have concerns about the geological stability of this area?" The moment of truth? Margaret could feel everyone's attention focused on her like a laser. Sarah's warning squeeze on her arm, Pinnacle's barely controlled panic, Morrison's legal calculations, the reporter's hungry anticipation. "I commissioned a geological survey 3 years ago," Margaret said quietly. "It identified significant limestone cave systems beneath the eastern section of the property. The survey concluded that any substantial weight placed on that ground would eventually cause catastrophic subsidence." The silence that followed was deafening. "You had a geological survey done," Jessica's voice sharpened. "What did you do with that information?" "I presented it to the county commission during the public hearings. I shared it with the developers. I begged them to do their own updated survey before beginning construction." David Pinnacle found his voice. "That survey was conducted by a biased party with a clear financial interest in stopping the development. The county's environmental study from 1987 showed no geological concerns. The county's study was nearly 40 years old and focused on water quality, not ground stability," Margaret shot back. Dr. Elizabeth Warren from Georgia Tech specifically warned that the limestone cave system was unstable and could collapse under residential development. Dr. Warren was paid by your legal team, Morrison interjected. Her conclusions were clearly influenced by your agenda. Sarah stepped forward, her nurse's training taking over. Her agenda was trying to save lives. How many people were in those houses this morning? The question hit like a physical blow. Margaret watched the color drain from Pinnacle's face as the full implications of the disaster settled in. 58 houses, morning rush hour, families getting ready for work and school. The search and rescue teams are still working, Morrison said carefully. We don't have confirmed casualty numbers yet, but Margaret could see it in his eyes. They knew emergency responders had been working for hours without finding a single survivor. The collapse had been too fast to complete. The limestone caverns that had swallowed the subdivision had become a mass grave. Mrs. Chen, Jessica Torres pressed, are you saying this disaster could have been prevented? Margaret looked at the crater where a community had existed that morning, where children had played on swings and parents had worried about mortgage payments and homeowners association fees, where dreams of suburban prosperity had been built on a foundation of stolen land and willful ignorance. Yes, she said simply, it could have been prevented. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret saw Morrison's face tighten. As he calculated the legal implications, saw Pinnacle's hands shake as he realized his company's liability, saw the reporter's eyes light up as she sensed the story of her career unfolding. You're saying Pinnacle Properties ignored geological warnings? Jessica Torres's voice carried the tone of someone who'd just struck gold. I'm saying they dismissed scientific evidence because it conflicted with their financial interests, Margaret replied. I'm saying the county commissioners approved this development without requiring updated geological studies. I'm saying everyone involved chose to believe that 40-year-old environmental data was sufficient to ensure public safety. This is completely inappropriate, Morrison interrupted. Mrs. Chen is clearly attempting to deflect attention from her own role in this tragedy. If she had genuine safety concerns, she should have pursued proper legal channels instead of making public accusations. Sarah's laugh was bitter. Proper legal channels? You mean the same legal channels that ruled her concerns were frivolous? The same courts that sided with your client, despite the geological evidence. The courts ruled based on established property law and credible evidence, Morrison shot back. Not on biased surveys commissioned by a disgruntled landowner. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. 3 years of being dismissed, ignored, and legally outmaneuvered had prepared her for this moment. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. What's that? Jessica Torres asked, her cameraman automatically zooming. In correspondence, Margaret said, opening the envelope, letters I sent to Pinnacle Properties, the County Commission, the State Environmental Agency, and the Governor's Office, all detailing the geological risks identified in Dr. Warren's survey, all warning of the potential for catastrophic ground collapse. She pulled out the first letter, dated 18 months ago. This one went to Mr. Pinnacle directly. I wrote, and I quote, the limestone cave system beneath the eastern section of the property presents an imminent danger to any residential development. Construction of homes on this ground will inevitably result in catastrophic subsidence and potential loss of life. Pinnacle's face went ashen. We receive hundreds of letters from people opposing development projects. We can't be expected to. This one went to County Commissioner Roberts, Margaret continued, pulling out another letter. I wrote, the 1987 environmental study is insufficient to ensure public safety. A current geological survey is essential before approving residential construction on this site. The limestone cave system documented in the 1940s. Mining survey remains a clear and present danger. She looked up at Jessica Torres's camera. I have 17 letters. 17 attempts to warn the people responsible for public safety. 17 times I was told my concerns were frivolous, self-serving, or legally irrelevant. Morrison stepped forward, his lawyer's instincts finally overriding his shock. Mrs. Chen, I strongly advise you to stop making public statements without legal counsel present. Anything you say could be used against you in future proceedings. Used against me? Margaret's voice rose. Mr. Morrison, I'm not the one who built houses on unstable ground. I'm not the one who ignored geological warnings. I'm not the one who put profit over public safety. You're the one who stood to benefit. The call came at 3:17 a.m., 6 days after the collapse. Margaret jolted awake to the shrill ring of her landline, the sound cutting through the silence like a scream. Sarah's voice carried from the kitchen, tense and urgent. "Mom, you need to take this. It's Attorney General Patricia Williams." Margaret pulled on her robe and padded to the kitchen, where Sarah stood holding the cordless phone with white knuckles. The past week had transformed their quiet farmhouse into the epicenter of a media circus. News vans lined their driveway. Reporters camped outside their gate. Federal investigators had set up a temporary command center in the high school gymnasium. "Mrs. Chen, I apologize for the late hour." Attorney General Williams's voice carried the weight of someone who hadn't slept in days. "We need to meet tonight. There are developments in the case that require immediate discussion." "What kind of developments?" "The kind that can't be discussed over the phone." "Can you be at the state capitol in 2 hours?" Margaret looked at Sarah, who was already reaching for her car keys. "We'll be there." The drive to Atlanta passed in tense silence, broken only by the radio reports that had become the soundtrack to their lives. The official death toll stood at 47 people, with 11 still missing and presumed dead. The sinkhole had stabilized at roughly 6 acres, a massive wound in the earth that geologists estimated would take decades to fill naturally. But it was the other numbers that made Margaret's chest tight with guilt and responsibility. 47 wrongful death lawsuits filed against Pinnacle Properties, 17 more against the county commission. Federal investigators had uncovered a web of permit violations, safety shortcuts, and what one official called criminal negligence on a scale rarely seen in residential development. "You couldn't have stopped this," Sarah said quietly as they passed the exit from Millbrook Springs. "Even if they'd listened to you, it wouldn't have brought back Dad's family land." Margaret didn't answer. The truth was more complicated than Sarah understood. The limestone caverns that had swallowed the subdivision were the same. Ones her great-grandfather had used to hide during the anti-Chinese violence of 1887, the same caverns where he'd stored the deed to the land when local officials tried to steal it the first time. The irony was almost poetic. The ground that had protected her family's claim to the land had ultimately destroyed the development built on its theft. The state capitol building loomed against the pre-dawn darkness, its dome illuminated like a beacon. Security guards escorted them through empty corridors to a conference room where Attorney General Williams waited with 3 other officials Margaret didn't recognize. Patricia Williams was younger than Margaret had expected, maybe 50, with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that probably made opposing lawyers nervous. She stood as they entered, extending a firm handshake. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for coming. Please, sit." Williams gestured to chairs across from a table covered with files, photographs, and what looked like engineering reports. "Before we begin, I need to ask, do you have legal representation?" "I haven't felt the need for a lawyer," Margaret replied carefully. "I'm not the one who built houses on unstable ground." Williams exchanged glances with the other officials. "Mrs. Chen, based on our investigation, you may be the key witness in the largest criminal prosecution in Georgia's history. Recommend you obtain counsel before we proceed." "Criminal prosecution?" "We have evidence of fraud, bribery, and willful endangerment of public safety. The scope of the conspiracy goes far beyond Pinnacle Properties." Williams opened one of the files. "Your documented warnings weren't just ignored, Mrs. Chen. They were actively suppressed." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly. "What do you mean?" Williams pulled out a photographic copy of one of Margaret's certified letters to the county commission, but this one had handwritten notes in the margins. "We found this in County Commissioner Roberts's personal files. See the notation at the bottom." Margaret leaned forward to read the spidery handwriting. "Geological survey inconclusive. Recommend burial pending development completion. Liability concerns minimal if Chen claims lack documentation." "Burial?" Sarah's voice cracked. "They buried Mom's warnings on purpose." "It gets worse." Williams opened another file. "We've uncovered evidence that Pinnacle Properties commissioned their own geological survey 18 months ago. Dr. Michael Harrison from the University of Georgia conducted a comprehensive study of the limestone cave system." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "What did it say?" Williams slid a thick report across the table. The cover page bore the Pinnacle Properties logo and a date stamp from 14 months ago. Margaret opened it with trembling hands and read the executive summary aloud. Extensive limestone cave system presents significant risk of catastrophic subsidence. Residential development not recommended without extensive ground stabilization, costing approximately $12 million per acre. The silence in the room was deafening. They knew, Margaret whispered. They had their own survey that confirmed everything Dr. Warren found, and they built anyway. Dr. Harrison was paid a consulting fee of $50,000 for his work. Williams continued, 3 weeks after submitting this report, he received an additional $200,000. Payment from a shell company traced back to Pinnacle Properties. The report was sealed and never filed with the county. Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. You're telling us that they not only ignored Mom's warnings, but buried their own experts' findings? How many people knew? That's where it gets complicated. Williams opened a third file, this one thick with bank records and email printouts. County Commissioner Roberts received $75,000. In campaign contributions from companies linked to Pinnacle Properties over the past 3 years, the building inspector who approved the foundation work was David Pinnacle's brother-in-law. The county engineer who signed off on the environmental impact assessment owned stock in Pinnacle. Properties worth approximately $300,000. Margaret stared at the evidence spread across the table. A conspiracy that reached into every level of local government. A web of corruption that had put profit over human life and cost 47 people their lives. There's more, Williams said quietly. We found evidence that several residents of Millbrook Springs had started asking questions about ground stability. The Homeowners Association received at least 6 complaints about unusual settling in foundations, cracks in basement walls, and what one resident described as hollow sounds when walking on certain parts of their property. What happened to those complaints? They were referred to Robert Kraft, the HOA president. He dismissed them as normal settling and told residents that raising geological concerns could damage property values and violate their homeowners' covenants. Williams pulled out another document. 3 weeks before the collapse, a resident named Jennifer Walsh hired a private inspector to examine cracks in her foundation. The inspector recommended immediate geological assessment. Margaret remembered the name from the casualty list. Jennifer Walsh, age 34, mother of 2 young children. What did Kraft do? He threatened to sue her for violating the architectural review process by hiring an unauthorized inspector. He told her that any geologic testing would require HOA approval, which could take 6 months to process. Sarah turned from the window, her face pale with rage. So they silenced the residents too. It appears so. The same residents who testified against your mother's concerns 3 years ago were prevented from raising their own concerns when the danger became obvious. Margaret felt a strange mix of vindication and horror. She'd been right about the geological dangers, but being right felt like a Pyrrhic victory when so many people had died. Mrs. Chen Williams leaned forward. We need your cooperation to build a case against everyone involved in this conspiracy. Your documented warnings, your geological survey, your attempts to alert authorities, all of it is crucial evidence. What are you asking me to do? Testify before a grand jury. Help us trace the connections between the corruption and the cover-up. Show the jury that this wasn't an unforeseeable natural disaster, but a preventable tragedy caused by criminal negligence. Margaret looked at the photographs of the sinkhole that had consumed an entire community. 47 people dead because greed had trumped science. Families destroyed because profit margins mattered more than public safety. What about the civil lawsuits? Sarah asked. The wrongful death cases. Williams smiled grimly. With the evidence we've uncovered, Pinnacle Properties will be lucky to avoid criminal bankruptcy. The county's insurance won't cover intentional misconduct. The families of the victims will likely recover hundreds of millions in damages, and the people responsible, David Pinnacle, is looking at 15 to 20 years for fraud and negligent homicide. Commissioner Roberts could face 10 years for bribery and conspiracy. His brother-in-law is already negotiating a plea deal. Williams's voice hardened. We're treating this as a criminal conspiracy that resulted in mass casualties. Everyone involved will face the full consequences of their actions, Margaret thought. About Robert Kraft, the HOA president, who'd called her delusional and filed a restraining order to silence her warnings. The man who'd died in his own home, crushed by the weight of his willful ignorance. Sometimes justice came. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. with overflow crowds watching on screens in the hallway. Margaret had never seen so many cameras, so many reporters, so many faces hungry for justice. 8 months after the collapse, the state of Georgia v. Pinnacle Properties had become the trial of the century, with Margaret Chen as the star witness in a case that would determine whether 47 deaths had been murder or negligence. She sat in the witness box wearing her grandmother's pearl necklace, the same one she'd worn to her father's funeral and her wedding. Her hands were steady as she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth. After 3 years of being called a liar, the irony wasn't lost on her. Mrs. Chen, District Attorney Williams, began. Please tell the jury about your family's connection to the land where Millbrook Springs Estates was built. Margaret's voice carried clearly through the courtroom. My great-grandfather, Chen Wei, purchased 127 acres in what is now Millbrook Springs in 1887. He paid $340 in gold, which he'd saved from working the railroad. The land has been in my family for 138 years. And what happened to that land 3 years ago? It was stolen. Margaret's words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Through a fabricated surveying error and legal manipulation, 125 acres were transferred to Pinnacle Properties for development. David Pinnacle's defense attorney, Marcus Webb, started to object, but Williams continued. Mrs. Chen, did you have concerns about developing that particular land? Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a leather portfolio, her great-grandfather's original surveyor maps. Hand-drawn in fading ink, my great-grandfather mapped every inch of this property, including the limestone cave system that runs beneath the eastern section. He knew the ground was unstable. How did he know? Because he hid in those caves during the anti-Chinese riots of 1887. Local authorities were trying to force Chinese families off their land. My great-grandfather spent 3 months underground documenting every tunnel, every chamber, every unstable section. Margaret opened the portfolio, revealing detailed sketches of cave systems. He marked the dangerous areas in red ink, every spot where the ground could collapse. A murmur ran through the courtroom. In the defendant's section, David Pinnacle stared at the maps with the expression of a man watching his own execution. Mrs. Chen, what did you do with this information when Pinnacle Properties announced their development plans? I commissioned a modern geological survey to confirm what my great-grandfather had documented. Dr. Elizabeth Warren from Georgia Tech verified that the limestone cave system was unstable and could collapse under residential development. Williams approached the witness stand. What happened when you shared this information with the defendants? Margaret's voice hardened. They called me a liar, said I was making up science to stop their project. County Commissioner Roberts told me that hysterical old women in Sank Chinese maps wouldn't stop progress in Millbrook Springs. Objection! Marcus Webb shot to his feet, inflammatory and prejudicial. Overruled. Judge Harrison said firmly, the witness may continue. Margaret looked directly at David Pinnacle. I sent 17 certified letters warning about the geological dangers. I begged them to do updated surveys. I pleaded with them to at least avoid building on the eastern section where the caves were deepest. What was their response? They filed a lawsuit against me for harassment. They had me served with a restraining order, prohibiting me from contacting county officials about the development. They called me delusional and bitter. Margaret's voice rose slightly. And while they were silencing me, they were conducting their own geological survey that confirmed every warning I'd given them. Williams pulled out a thick document. Mrs. Chen, I'm showing you Exhibit 47. Dr. Michael Harrison's geological assessment commissioned by Pinnacle Properties. Have you seen this before? Yes. It confirms everything my great-grandfather mapped in 1887 and everything Dr. Warren found in her survey. It specifically states that residential development would cause catastrophic subsidence. And what did Pinnacle Properties do with this report? Margaret looked at the families of the victims sitting in the front rows. Widows and widowers, parents who'd lost children, children who'd lost parents. They buried it. Paid Dr. Harrison $200,000 to keep quiet. Built 58 houses on ground they knew would collapse. The courtroom erupted. Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, but the anger was palpable. Margaret watched David Pinnacle shrink in his chair as the full weight of his actions settled over the room. Mrs. Chen Williams continued when order was restored. Did you make any final attempts to warn the residents of Millbrook Springs Estates? 3 weeks before the collapse, I sent a letter to every homeowner through the HOA. I told them about the geological risks. I begged them to demand their own safety inspections. What happened to that letter? Robert Kraft, the HOA president, intercepted it. He called it fear-mongering, designed to damage property values, and threatened to sue me for harassment if I contacted residents again. Margaret paused, looking at the empty chair where Robert Kraft would have sat if he'd survived the collapse. Of his own home, Mrs. Chen, on the morning of the collapse, where were you? In my kitchen, watching the subdivision through my window. What did you see? Margaret closed her eyes, remembering. I saw the ground crack. I saw 58 houses slide into the earth like they were made of paper. I saw an entire community disappear in 30 minutes. What did you feel? The question hung in the air. Margaret looked at the victims' families, then at David Pinnacle, then at the jury of 12 people who would decide whether justice would be served. Horror, she said quietly, and guilt, because I knew it was going to happen, and I couldn't stop it. Mrs. Chen, in your opinion, could this disaster have been prevented? Yes, if Pinnacle Properties had listened to any of the geological warnings, those 47 people would be alive today. If County Commissioner Roberts hadn't buried my letters, families would have been warned. If Robert Kraft hadn't silenced residents' safety concerns, people could have evacuated. Margaret's voice strengthened. This wasn't a natural disaster. It was murder by greed. Objection. Marcus Webb was on his feet again. The witness is not qualified to. I'll allow it, Judge Harrison said. The witness has first-hand knowledge. Of the defendant's actions, Williams turned to the jury. Mrs. Chen, what do you want to see happen now? Margaret stood slowly, her grandmother's pearls catching the courtroom lights. I want accountability. I want everyone who ignored the warnings to face the consequences. I want the families of the victims to know that their loved ones didn't die because of some unforeseeable act of God. She looked directly at David Pinnacle. They died because you chose profit over human life. Because you decided that $12 million in ground stabilization was too expensive, but 47 wrongful death settlements weren't. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, and I want my family's land back. All of it, the 125 acres that were stolen through fraud and corruption. I want it returned to honor the memory of my great-grandfather, who protected it with his life, and the 47 people who died because others failed to protect theirs. Margaret sat down, feeling lighter than she had in 3 years. She'd finally told her truth to people who were ready to listen. The trial lasted 6 more weeks. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. David Pinnacle, guilty on 47 counts of negligent homicide, 25 years in prison. County Commissioner Roberts, guilty of bribery and conspiracy, 15 years. In prison, Building Inspector Michael Pinnacle, guilty of fraud and official misconduct, 10 years in prison. Pinnacle Properties dissolved, assets liquidated to pay victim settlements totaling $847 million. The county settled Margaret's civil lawsuit for the return of her family's original 127 acres plus $15 million in damages. More importantly, they issued a formal apology acknowledging that her warnings had been deliberately suppressed and her reputation falsely damaged. 1 year after the collapse, Margaret stood in her kitchen looking out at her restored land. The sinkhole had been filled and covered with native wildflowers. A memorial garden marked the spot where 50 had stood, with 47 granite stones bearing the names of the victims. Sarah found her there, holding a cup of coffee and her great-grandfather's original deed. Any regrets? Sarah asked. Margaret thought about the question. 3 years of legal battles, 47 dead neighbors, a community destroyed by greed and corruption. She looked at the memorial garden where children from neighboring towns came to play among the wildflowers, where families picnicked on weekends and teenagers brought their dates to watch the sunset. The land that had been stolen for suburban development had become something better, a place of remembrance and natural beauty. Margaret's great-grandfather had hidden in limestone caves to protect this land from those who would take it. In the end, those same caves had protected it again, swallowing the development that never should have been built and returning the earth to those who truly understood its value. Sometimes justice came from the ground up. Sometimes the land